أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Welcome to what will be, I hope, a very special video, a very unique video. The topic which I would like to address is the Persian language, but the Persian language as a pillar of classical Islamic civilization. Let me elaborate. What motivated me to make this video is the unfortunate neglect and lack of interest in the Persian language by many people who, when they enter Islamic studies, focus exclusively on Arabic and periods involving Arabic. And even though they may not wish to do any research in that area, they don't bother learning Persian. I think that leaves them at a disadvantage, even if they're working in an area, I should say a topic or a subfield which exclusively relies and only needs to rely on Arabic sources. There's something missing in their perspective. In addition, in the American Muslim community, I live in the United States, there is a complete and total lack of interest in Persian. This is particularly true in the Sunni Muslim community. There have been many laudable efforts and attempts to further the study of Arabic by non-native speakers, in as much as Arabic is absolutely fundamental to being a Muslim. You have to pray in Arabic, you recite the Quran in Arabic, and so the more you know of Arabic, the better it is. And obviously, if you want to read works on Islamic law, theology, etc., the most important ones are all written in Arabic. And there's also a kind of Arabization that we find among American Muslims, where they try and use Arabic expressions even more than they would be used by Arabic speakers. For example, American Muslims are constantly saying Jazakallah khair, Jazakallah khair, Jazakallah khair, and even they don't get the grammar right. Women are saying to each other Jazakallah khair, it's just a mess. And other expressions like this, there's a sort of Arab wannabe kind of sense. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that if you want to Arabize yourself and so on and so forth. But there's a tremendous portion of classical Islamic civilization which is in Persian. And unfortunately, Persian is perceived very much also, I would say, primarily, obviously, by the Sunni Muslim community, especially in America, but Arabs as well in the Arab world, as being somehow Shīʿī. This is just simply not true. Now, I will say that there was a tremendous contribution of Western Islamic lands, so North Africa, Egypt, Muslim Spain, where Persian really didn't figure into the picture. So what I'm really talking about when I speak of Persian is in the later periods of Islamic history, and particularly in what we would say is the more eastern side of the Islamic world. But Eastern as a term is deceptive, so if we were a bit more geographically specific, it would include a large chunk of Eurasia. In other words, we would have to go from the geographic region of the Balkans, so let's say Bosnia, Herzegovina, Albania, Kosovo, all the way across. Of course, that would include, really those were parts, Ottoman Turkey, but modern day Turkey, obviously Iran, but also what is today modern day Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, what is modern day Bangladesh, points further east as well, all the way to the borders of China. Persian was not a language which was confined to the borders of what is present-day Iran. In the modern world, Persian in some form or another, obviously, is the dominant or national language, or one of the national languages in the following countries. Obviously, the first is Iran. This is a modern reality. It was not always the case, but also the modern nation state of Tajikistan and the modern nation state of Afghanistan. Obviously, those are not the official names of those countries, but you know what I'm talking about. In Afghanistan, you have a form of Persian which is called Dari. You also have other languages like Pashto. This is very important. There are other smaller languages that are with more minority status like Uzbek, Turkmen. And in Iran, of course, Persian. Minority languages there are things like Ḥāኢና and things like that, which are not related to Persian. And then in Tajikistan, the language is called Tajiki. But this leaves out a whole other entire region, as well as, more than one region, but also entire periods of history. So just by way of example, many years ago, I visited Iran. I was only able to visit there once because I have a passport of the Great Satan, as it is known in that part of the world. I have a U.S. passport, so it's not easy to go there. But anyway, a long time ago, some 2 decades ago, I managed to go there for a conference. And I happened to be there during the Tehran Book Fair. So I acquired many of these marvelous volumes in this library during that book fair. And one of them, which I don't have here at the moment, is in storage, is a very large work called the Danishnameh Adabiyat Farsi. In other words, the Encyclopedia of Persian Literature. But it was devoted to Persian literature outside of the current borders of Iran. This is a large work. The first volume is essentially a dictionary of various literary terms, so let's put that on one side. And then we have one volume each devoted to what is today Afghanistan and what is today Tajikistan. So in this encyclopedia, you'll have biographical entries on important people. You'll have topical entries on various aspects of literature, genres, and so forth. And then there are 3, not 1, not 2, 3 entire volumes devoted to Persian in India. Now, oddly enough, there was not a volume devoted to Ottoman Turkey. It would have been interesting if there was. But my point here is these are large volumes. Each one is about 18 inches, like the size of the height of my arm, and they are thick. They are very thick, 400 or 500 pages. They're if you're familiar with the Oxford English Dictionary, each volume is something like that. It's pretty hefty. If you stack them all up, each one is a serious doorstopper. So Persian was an extremely important language. It was used throughout the Ottoman. It was very much a language of learned people in the Ottoman Empire. It was very much although that's not the language most people would have spoke, but in the Mughal Empire, it was also an extremely important language. And in the case of India, there were many people who actually spoke it as a spoken language, along with some variety of local speech, especially in northern India. Just by way of example, let's say in the Balkans, there is a famous lexicographer of the Ottoman language named Sami Bey, Shamsuddin Sami Bey. He wrote one of the first Ottoman dictionaries. He also wrote Ottoman French, French Ottoman. Well, he was actually Albanian, and he had a brother named Ahmad Faraj-Shahri, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. But Ahmad Faraj-Shahri was deeply immersed in Persian letters and literature, and he was from modern-day Albania. And he, in fact, wrote a grammar of the Persian language called Nahve Farsi be Tarz Navin, the Persian grammar in a new style. I have searched far and wide for this book in Istanbul. I've never found it. But the fact is that his services, as it were, to Persian grammar, lexicography, and whatnot, were immortalized in a stamp issued by the Islamic Republic of Iran. I don't have an example. Maybe if we find one on the net, I'll put it in the video. But in a stamp issued by the Islamic Republic of Iran. So if you look in Sufi tariqats, for example, in the Balkans, like the Bektashi tariqa, they have important literature in Persian. So it's not just the language, but the literary dimensions as well of a very important form of lyric verse known as the ghazal, and other forms which influence the literatures of other languages. My understanding is that this is true in Albanian. Apparently the national Albanian epic, which is by Ahmad Faraj-Shahri, is actually called the Karbala Nama, if I'm not mistaken, and is tied in with the history of Karbala. So maybe in the case of Ahmad Frayshari, there is a Shi'i element. By all indications, it seems he was part of the Bektashi Tariqa, which has certain Shi'i elements in the sense of the veneration of the Ahl Bayt alayhim salam and Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam in particular. But Persian literature and literary styles also influenced Ottoman poetry, for example. So look, let me show you something. This is a pretty rare book which I picked up in Istanbul, and it consists of, although this is a printed book, this consists of 40 verses from the famous poem of Jalaluddin Rumi, which is known as the Masnavi, and it is interspersed with commentary on them in Ottoman. So I'll just give you a picture of this. This is a very rare book. Look at that. It's beautiful, isn't it? In a beautiful Nastaliq script. It's some kind of an actual font. And I was very lucky to come across this book. But Persian literature also deeply influenced Urdu literature. There wouldn't be any Urdu, really, if it wasn't for Persian. The same is true for Ottoman. Ottoman Turkish is extremely heavily influenced, or there is a kind or a style of writing in Ottoman which is heavily influenced by Persianate styles. So, for example, I don't have any examples here, but Ottoman histories. I remember in Istanbul, I was in a bookshop. I looked at some various Ottoman histories. I didn't buy any of them, but the chapter headings are basically in Persian. So there was a tremendous influence, and it's interesting that Suleiman Qanuni, or Suleiman the Magnificent as he is known, actually has a divan of poetry in Persian. And oddly enough, the person who can be credited as being the founder of modern day Iran, or the Safavid Empire anyway, and the modern day sense of the borders is very much similar to that area, which the Safavids initially carved out, and that is Shah Ismail. Shah Ismail, his divan of poetry is in some form of Turkish. Some people will claim it's Azeri, they'll claim it's this or that. These are linguistic controversies I do not wish to enter into, but he wrote poetry in Turkish with the pen name of Ḥāṭirī. Enough said about those regions. I want to focus on India. But my point in all of this is that Persian was a language, it was a culture, it was a literature. It was part of what my colleague Mohsen al-Musawi, who's a critic and scholar of Arabic literature, was referring to in his book called The Republic of Letters, except he was talking about Arabic. Persian itself and Persianate learning, in other words, a broader sort of socio-linguistic and kind of literary sphere, was very much something which encompassed much more than the rather circumscribed borders of modern-day Iran. And there were people who identified with that literature and that culture. And what really got me thinking on this was a beautiful book by Manakia called Persianate Selves, Memories of Place and Origin Before Nationalism. It has a beautiful cover. And there are glowing blurbs and endorsements of this book by scholars the caliber of Niall Green from UCLA, Catherine Babian, a very serious scholar of Persian history from the University of Michigan, Muzaffar Alam from the University of Chicago. This is a beautiful book, and especially if you are of South Asian heritage, India, Pakistan area, I would urge you to read this book. There are a number of major figures whom she deals with, and many of them are from what is today India or Pakistan. Among these is Sirajuddin Ali Khan Arzu, who died in 1169 of the Hijri, or 1756, Common Era. Mir Ghulam Ali Azad Bilgrami, died 1200 Hijri, 1786. These are just some important figures. There's also, of course, the figure of Sheikh Muhammad Ali Hazin Lahiji, who died in 1180 or 1766. He was born in Isfahan, but for various reasons migrated to India and lived in India. Khaja Abdul Karim Kashmiri, 1784. Mir Muhammad Taqi Mir, a great poet of the Urdu language. Some would argue he was the greatest. He died 1225 or 1810. She does not include, but I would include Mirza Ghalib as well, considered by many also to be the greatest poet in the Urdu language. It's always a competition between Ghalib and Mir. But this is a beautiful book. And one of the people who endorsed this book or wrote a blurb, namely Niall Green, has his own edited volume. This is Manakia's is not an edited volume, but Niall Green's The Persianate World, The Frontiers of a Eurasian Lingua Franca is an edited volume. It's a really important book. Let me just read to you from the blurb on the back, the description on the back. Persian is one of the great lingua francas of world history. Yet despite its recognition as a shared language across the Islamic world and beyond, its scope, impact, and mechanisms remain underexplored. A world historical inquiry into pre-modern cosmopolitanism, the Persianate World traces the reach and limits of Persian as a Eurasian language in a comprehensive survey of its geographical, literary, and social frontiers. Pay close attention to the next sentence. From Siberia to Southeast Asia and between London and Beijing, this book shows how Persian gained, maintained, and finally surrendered its status to imperial and vernacular competitors. So there are 14 contributions to this book, and they look at the interactions and trace the influences of Persian with languages as diverse as, in alphabetical order, well, no, not in alphabetical order, in the order given here, Bengali, Chinese, different forms of Turkish, Punjabi, as well as other languages. This is really a fascinating book and shows you just how far-reaching the influence of Persian was both in time and in space. Finally, in this reading list, I would like to mention a book, also an edited volume, edited by Brian Spooner and William L. Hanaway, entitled Literacy in the Persianate World, Writing and the Social Order. This is a hardcover book. This is also an extremely interesting work with 12 different contributions with notable chapters devoted to Urdu, as well as Ottoman Turkish, scribal culture. I've already said Ottoman. And the relationship, oddly enough, between Persian scribes in China and Chinese literati, or scholars of Chinese literature. So Islam is very much a kind of empire, not so much a republic. It is a republic of letters or an empire of letters, but also a kind of empire of adab. And it's interesting. I'm very interested in Arabic calligraphy, and so there is a famous calligrapher in the Arabic language, but he happens to be a Chinese Muslim. He's ethnically Chinese, so he's part of the Hui nationality. His name is Haji Nuruddin. I've met him several times when he came here. He doesn't really speak English at all. He only speaks Chinese and some version of spoken Arabic, and I communicated with him in spoken, some kind of, colloquial Arabic. But the point is that we all had the same sort of cultural references. He would act the same way, like if you're a Muslim, you go to another Muslim's house, there's a certain way you act. And in conversation with him, I confirmed what I had read in scholarly literature, that the Islamic vocabulary used by Chinese Muslims is derived mainly from Persian. So that was a very interesting thing. If you're more interested in this whole influence of Islam in China and also through Persian Sufi texts has been looked at by William Chittick and his wife Sachiko Murata. They have a famous book called Sufi Gleams of Chinese Light, I think, and there's a couple of other books which she has written, which you can look up. I don't want to get too far off topic. So I had said that in the Danishnameh Adabiyat Farsi, 3 entire massive volumes are devoted to Persian literary production in India. And it's interesting that there's a whole section just on dictionaries of the Persian language written in India. Among the most important is probably the Farhang Asifi. Most of these, if not all of these, have been republished in Iran. The Farhang Asifi, for example, or the Farhang Anandraj is another important Persian dictionary. The Lughat Kishori, some people say it's Kishvari, but it's Kishori because the publisher was a Hindu publisher in Lucknow, the city of my birth, named Munshi Naval Kishore. So there was a huge use of the Persian language up until my grandfather's time. I'll say more about that in a moment, but as an example of a book published at this press, here is a famous work by Nasiruddin Tusi in Persian on ethics entitled the Akhlaq-e Nasiri. The original cover has come off, and this was published in Lucknow. It's lithographed, but this is all Persian. I want to hold this carefully. I don't want to break the binding. It's a very fragile work, just to give you an idea. Nasiruddin Tusi died in 672. This book on ethics is also an example of the very ornate writing style, a very prolix and verbose, but I would say at the same time a very beautiful style of writing, with which this book in particular and this author is well known. Another of these would be the Tarikh-e-Jahan Gushai, for example, a history of the world conqueror, is another highly complicated form of prose writing in Persian. But this was one of the textbooks one of the books on the reading list if you wanted to be the equivalent of an MA in Persian in those days. That was on the reading list. There were other very important works on the reading list. And of course, there's a lot of these famous works of Persian literature published in India. The most probably famous collection of poems or lyrical poems, sonnet-like poems, or what's called the Persian ghazal, is the Diwan of Hafiz. Well, this was originally published in India. This is a Pakistani reprint from Lahore. This is the Diwan of Hafiz. And this is the translation of Qazi Sajjad Hussain. And his editions have his translations and editions have an interlinear Urdu translation. So there will be a line of Persian in a larger calligraphic hand, and then in a smaller hand, you will have the translation in Urdu, and there are footnotes and marginalia on the margins. This is a beautiful copy. Other Persian works which were read in India, and these are still published in India. This is the Bustan of Saadi, and this again is Qazi Sajjad Hussain. This is a work of poetry, very famous book. This was studied by everyone. My father would have studied this book. My grandfather would have been familiar with this book. So up until my grandfather's time, Persian was still quite important. There's another very important book that everyone in the Persian tradition reads. This is the Gulistan of Saadi. Very beautiful book, the Gulistan. Again, Indian edition with the translation of Qazi Sajjad Hussain. Again, it's a lithograph. Now, if you're Iranian and you're watching this, you might notice that the Nastaliq script used in India looks a little bit different than what you have in Iran. That's true, but it is still Nastaliq. Ottoman Turks write Nastaliq slightly differently. If you know what you're doing, you can see. If you're interested in the Gulistan, there's a very good translation with the dual language text by Wheeler Thaxton. I can't really explain too much about these books, but they're extremely, extremely important for Persian literature, and they influenced basically everybody. So Persian was extremely important even up until my father's time. And in fact, I'm going to show you, this is my late father's Persian textbook. He must have been 6, 7, 8 years old. I'm not entirely sure. He has his name, Sayyid Farid Ahmadi, rahimahullah. He died a few years ago in the month of Safar, which would be next month. So these are actually more than one book bound together. This is called the Masdar-e Fuyuz, which is a book on Persian morphology. the verb, and there are verb tables and things like this in here if you just want to get. So here's a section on what's known as the murakkab izafi, if you want to. So it's a Persian textbook, but it's written in Urdu. Yeah. And there are some. So I said there was more than one book here bound together. So the book from which people learned how to conjugate verbs in Persian in the old days, my grandfather's time, was a book called the Safwatul Masadir, also known as the Ahmad Nama. It's a this book is probably still in print, but this is a really old copy, as you can see. I mean, if you want to get an idea, this is probably from about 1938, 1940. My father was born in 1932. Here is the opening, and it's called the Ahmadanama because Ahmadan is the first, to arrive or to come is the first verb that they learn to conjugate. Because alphabetically it comes first. The alif with a mad is first in Persian. So if you want to get an idea, here's some various verbs like arastan, aramidan, azmudan, asudan, ashamidan, ashuftan, aghustan, etc. So this was quite a serious study. So these were the first things that people learned. They would go to the mosque, they would learn how to read the Quran, but then the actual language which they would learn would be Persian. So here's there's 3 books bound here in 1926. So this is a book about how to, compose simple sentences and things in Arabic. It's called the Gulzar-e Dabistan. Now this is in pretty bad shape, but I just want to Gulzar-e Dabistan. And it just has some simple sentences for practice here. A lot of old sort of sentences which nobody would say anymore probably. Kulahat پیششان هست پیششان نیست etc. اکنون چگونه است که می آید. Yeah. So there's a lot of من اول به شما گفته بودم etc. Simple sentences. Like dialogues. Assalamu alaikum, alaikum assalam, mizaj ali, alhamdulillah, du'a jan shuma, khosh amadid, etc. So this is a textbook from my father's time. This is another old book. This is from Saiyad. These are some beautiful lines of poetry. کریما به بخشای بر حال ما که هستم اسیر کمند هوا, etc. So these were poetic, simple poems from Saiyad of Shiraz, which were taught to children. They would memorize these. So here's like Dar Sifat Sakhawat, describing generosity. Dar Mazammat Bakhil, talking about how it's not good to be stingy. Dar Wasf Dar Sifat Tawazu, in praise of humility. Dar Mazammat Takabbur, talking about arrogance. Dar Fazilat Ilm, the nobility of knowledge. Dar Sifat Adl, the nobility of justice. Dar Mazammat Zulm, just denouncing tyranny, etc. So these were sort of ethical, moral sort of teachings in poetic form, and there's sort of an exam paper at the end. Like you were supposed to ask the student if he can read this poem and understand it's over here. So these are extremely interesting aspect of what is now being very much lost in India. I have a whole stack of these. And then also from my father's time, there was a work which was read, this is in very bad shape, called the Anwar-e Suhaili. I mean, look at this. This is in, I don't know if you can come here. But this was also published at the Hindu publishing house of Munshi Nawal Kishore, as written on the bottom line. You can read that there if you can read Persian. There was also this work which my father read. This is Yusuf wa Zulaykha. Let me straighten it out a bit. It's 1316 of the Hijrah. Look at that. Very old book. This was published in the Mustafa'i Press. So this is an era which is now gone. In India and Pakistan, now most people do not really study Persian. It has ceased to be a thing. It's very unfortunate. But a lot of old documents are in Persian. And it's a kind of a conservatism or a tradition. A lot of official documents, because especially from that time, are still in Persian. And even now, I mean, what's called in Arabic would be a marriage contract. In Persian, Urdu, it would be called nikahnama. My nikahnama is in Persian. So you have that. Let's see some other things here. Just by way of also, historically speaking, one of the first histories of Persian poetry was actually written in Urdu in India. It's called Shi'r al-Ajam. It's in 4 volumes. It's by Shibli Nomani. It was really the first attempt to sort of do a history of Persian literature. It's by an Indian scholar. And this was coming out around the same time as E.G. Brown's A Literary History of Persia in 4 volumes. Is right here. So much so that it's so important that Brown even, especially towards the end, references Shibli Nomani and quotes him. This is a different sort of book. It's a literary history of Persia, so it's whatever literature was produced by so-called ethnically Persian people. So even if they wrote in Arabic, they're mentioned by Brown. But that's a very famous book. Even the handwriting. There was a kind of writing which is now not really known in India and Pakistan, except by unless someone tries to learn it, there's very few people. My mother, she's like 80-something. She can read this. I learned to read it. It's called Shikasta. It's a very particular form of cursive writing in Persianate societies. And so here's an example. I'll show you. This is my mother's handwriting. This is Nastaliq, but it's what we would call a Shikasta Amez Nastaliq. It has our sort of Shikasta cursive elements. This is my mother's notes for her Urdu, for a Ph.D. she was doing at the time in Urdu. Look at that. On the development of characterization in the Urdu novel. So this was obviously done with a ballpoint pen, but there's very few people who can read this now. I remember when I was a child growing up, when I first learned about Nastaliq, my mother would teach us Urdu at home, and I was not very good at it. And we would get letters. This was way before the internet and all this. It was very expensive to make a phone call. And one of my uncles used to write in Shikasta, and he was sent a letter, and my mother showed me, said, "Oh, this is Shikasta. Not many people can read this anymore," even then. But if you are Iranian, you know exactly what I mean by what Shikasta is. And you can look in, I should have realized I should have had some other calligraphic examples of Shikasta. Maybe we should do a video on Arabic calligraphy at some point. But here I have examples My grandfather, Sayyid Rashid Ahmad, rahimahullah, was actually Rashid Faizabadi, as he was known, and was a poet. This is his poetry in Urdu. Some of these are from early 1940s. This is a ghazal in Urdu which he wrote. Okay, but I was looking through this stuff recently, and I came across an entire notebook in Persian as well. Now, he knew Persian, and I know he knew Persian. I'd heard him say things in Persian. In fact, I think the last sentence, if I'm not mistaken, that he ever spoke to me was in Persian. But here, there is a notebook of his. It's very old. Maybe you will have to come around. This is what we call in Urdu awraq-e pareshan. So some of these are even worm-eaten. So you see, this stuff is in Urdu, but here on this page, and there are many different notebooks of his diwan, it says Farsi. Okay. Now, I am not certain if this is his kalam, his speech, or it was like a kashkul, a literary miscellany, because people used to keep notebooks and write down poems which they liked, or lines of poetry which they liked. It may well be that. Some of this maybe is, I don't know. I'm not educated enough in Persian literature to really tell. Yeah, like this, for example. I don't know if this is his or what. Chashme maste ajabe, zulfe daraz ajabe, मैं परस्ते अजबे फितना तराज अजबे जान व दिल बालब जुल्फ़ तू फ़यामे दौरद गुफ्तगू अजबे राज व नियाज़ अजबे. There's also a different way that Persian was pronounced in India. It's called Indo-Persian. So the pronunciation is different from modern Iranian Persian. I don't think Iranians would probably like Indo-Persian pronunciation, but it's closer to the way, for example, that Persian is pronounced in Afghanistan. So there is a distinction between O and U and E and A in classical Persian. The O sound, which is not found in Arabic, and the A sound, which is also not found in Arabic, are respectively associated with the letter Waw and the letter Ya. And in classical Persian, this is recognized in textbooks on where classical Persian is dealt with, such as Thaxton's book on Persian, and also in the sort of, if I'm not mistaken, it would be a reference work. It's called the Dastur-e-Zaban Farsi by Badi'uz-Zaman Farozanfar. Now, right there, Farozanfar. Iranians will say Furuzanfar. There is a famous muhaqqiq of Arabic text named Bedarfar, but Iranians will say Bidarfar. So the word for friend in Persian is dost, but Iranians, Tehran people in particular, will say doost. The word for lion in Persian is sher, and the word for milk is shir. But in the Tehran pronunciation, shir, they're both pronounced the same way. So there are things like this. So the pronunciation is different. And there was also something called the nasal noon in Indo-Persian. You don't find it in Dari, and I don't think you find it in Tajiki. But so sometimes, especially if there's a final noon, it'll be nasalized. To use the words from Arabic linguistics, there is a ghunna, and in Urdu it's actually called a noon ghunna. So it's written a noon, but without a without a dot. So like the poet Iqbal Lahori, Muhammad Iqbal as he is known, Allama Iqbal, he has a line of poetry in which he says, okay, so if we recite it the way Iranians would talk, Tehran people, I think they would say, چون میگویم مسلمانم بلرزم که دانم مشکلات لا اله را, something like that. But if Indo-Persian person would say, چون میگویم مسلمانم بلرزم که دانم مشکلات لا اله را. Sounds different. Anyway, Persian is not just something which is the property of Iranians. It was a lingua franca. It was a language stretching across many lands, many spaces, and many times. And to use the very elegant phrase of Manikia, there were people who would be who identified, so to speak, with Persian letters, with Persian language and literature, and they had, as she calls it, Persianate selves, and to some extent, such selves still exist. Thank you very much for watching.